This is Kevin Lee with the Marketing Association. I also run Did It and Giving Forward. I'm here with Matt Turck to talk about podcast advertising and how crazy it's gone in the last few years. So first question for you, Matt, is what kinds of podcast advertising is available for marketers and agencies?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Kevin. Appreciate it. Uh, Interestingly enough, we launched Megaphone a little over 5 years ago, and this business was built out of the direct-to-consumer advertising. The host read driving somebody to a URL with a promo code so you can measure results, and it's a very effective way to market. The challenge with it is it's not built for brand advertising. Brand advertising, especially in the digital space, buys against audience. And 3 years ago, we launched our product, Megaphone Targeted Marketplace, it's powered by Nielsen, and we're able to target against audience at scale. And we're also able to provide data and measure those results. So today, if a brand advertiser wants to move into the space and wants to target against that audience, they can buy into the space that way. It's also a very effective way to market. We always say that host read is kind of the beachfront real estate because it works. But we do know that through attribution studies, through brand lift, that targeting against scale works, and we can provide the data and measurement that brands need in order to move into this space.
Do a lot of times the host reads end up getting used across different podcasts if one host is particularly popular and has sort of a really popular brand name? So if people actually end up using that spot across different podcasts?
Yeah, that does happen. That's not the business that we're in because we're selling against our network of podcasts and against the audience. But yeah, I've heard hosts. I'm pretty sure I've heard Malcolm Gladwell on other Pushkin Industry podcasts, and Malcolm does a heck of a host read.
Right.
And Pushkin has a terrific platform of podcasts, so sometimes they can use that against their own shows. We believe that the message and the advertisement or message is as important as the medium itself. We've created a studio to build out the messaging, not only from our past knowledge, me at Slate, and then moving into Megaphone. We've got 10 years of experience of what can make an effective ad. We've built out a studio that, believes telling a story, sequential advertising can be very effective. We test with a third party to make sure that it can perform well against KPIs before going live. But it needs to feel very in-stream. It needs to feel very native to the program. And we spend a lot of time figuring out how to do that in the best manner.
So I'm a member of the C-Suite network run by Jeffrey Hazlitt, and he runs a B2B podcast network. And generally people think of podcasts as more B2C. And you mentioned initially that it started off as a B2C direct response medium. So do you think the B2B opportunity is pretty significant as well?
There's no question about it. As you know, I know Jeffrey as well. Terrific guy. He's got a heck of a network, and the audience there is extremely important. You can identify by show what those audiences look like and target specifically against them if you're buying direct. But that programming is also in our marketplace. So if there is a financial advertiser that's targeting a high net worth professional, we can find that person when we're delivering an ad in real time. The CPMs against audiences like that can be very strong because they're difficult to find.
Sure. Yeah. No, B2B CPMs and RPMs are generally considerably better. So, because we're valuable, we've got cash.
and that's across all media, but it's, in podcasting, you can really see it.
Exactly.
Spending power.
A lot of marketers and agencies obviously got into video-based advertising earlier than they did podcast advertising, but they're trying to sometimes weigh the pros and cons of one versus the other. How should they think about video-based advertising, differently than podcast and audio-based advertising?
Well, I video advertising, it can work very well. We obviously know it's an effective way to market, but video advertising can be annoying. It is, sometimes you just want to listen to 60 or view a 60-second video, and you got to listen to a 20, 30-second ad prior to that. It can be a turnoff. Podcast advertising is much different. It's a lean forward medium. You've tuned into that show or that host, and you don't have to yell to get the listener's attention. You want it to feel very in stream. You want to feel it. You want it to be very comfortable within that show, and you want to tell a story or have a conversation with that listener. It doesn't have to be surprising. It doesn't have to be loud. It has to feel in stream, and there has to be connectivity there.
Yeah, no, the reason I laughed when you said loud or screaming is I immediately thought of auto advertising, right? Especially at the dealership level, and how they seem to, crank the loudness and the volume up to maximum when they do their spots.
Well, yeah, and that's it, and that's one of the things we're trying to learn in the podcast space. As so many, no, I shouldn't say so many, but some brand advertisers just want to take their audio assets that they've created for radio and move them into podcasting. And we, again, our studio team analyzes those ads to make sure they're going to work. And some can, but often, like a monster truck pull ad is gonna feel very disjointed and very uncomfortable in a podcast.
Right. So obviously, when marketers, either at the agency level or direct, are thinking about podcast advertising, they can think about it at the host level, they can think about it at the genre level, or they can think about the audiences that you guys deliver at scale. So how should they go through that thought process? Should they be doing all of those things simultaneously, or should they sort of start with audience and work their way back to genre? How should they think that through?
Well, I think, I think it could, to really do an effective podcast campaign, you may want to do a little bit of I don't necessarily know if genre advertising is as important as that host read. And I always suggest, even though we don't sell the host read, we sell audience at scale. I always suggest selecting a few shows where that host lines up well with what you're trying to accomplish, or the program itself lines up really well with what you're trying to accomplish as a marketer, and then use us for scale to really move that needle.
Right.
The challenge with the host read ad is there's a lot of waste. I was at the IAB upfronts the other year, and I asked the audience how many people have listened to a podcast. It's kind of a layup in the past 30 days, and everybody raised their hand. 250 people in the room. Then I asked an age qualifier, and I said you could fudge on it a little bit if you're uncomfortable, and 2/3 of the hands went down. And then I asked who's in the market for a new SUV. 2 hands remained up out of 250. So, therefore, if you're buying against the show and its full audience, there's a lot of waste. Even though it can be very effective, there's still a lot of waste. So pick a handful of shows that line up really well, and then buy audience at scale, and you're going to best move that needle, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, that's always been the premise of programmatic in general, right? And so obviously that's going to be the case too. If you can cherry pick out the people who are really in market and a perfect fit against your demographics and your psychographics, that's going to work better.
Yeah, and we are, we're kind of a handheld programmatic play in a sense, but we're working with the kind of the leads in the enterprise space, the iHearts of the world, the Wall Street Journals, the Slates and Voxes. So the brands that we have within our network are the lead brands out there, and so it's not programmatic in the sense that you're filling a lot of inventory that can't be sold. podcast, when it's sold direct, is bought show by show, spot by spot, and it's very difficult because of the timing of it as well. It's very difficult to fill all of the inventory. About 60% of the program's inventory comes to us from our partners because they're unable to sell it direct. And it's high quality programming. It is a very engaged listener, and it's not selling off kind of the riffraff. It's because of the structure of podcasting. You're still selling into the A-list shows with the best audiences and able to connect with those listeners.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to insinuate that programmatic meant bottom of the barrel. Obviously, with all the different flavors of programmatic these days, with programmatic direct and all sorts of deal IDs, you can get some pretty premium stuff there too. When audio and podcasts first started taking off, when you guys were founded, obviously, I think folks were listening in cars. Right. Now there's less commuting going on. So where are consumers consuming these podcasts? What are they multitasking when they're doing it? Are they, is there particular times of day that they consume the podcasts or common themes with their podcast consumption?
Well, I think, interestingly enough, prior to COVID-19, podcasts listening was spiking at drive time, which makes a great deal of sense. When COVID-19 hit, we saw that flatten out. We saw throughout the day, we saw listenership for news spike. We saw listenership for true crime fall, sports fall, which makes sense. It's all kind of come back to normalcy again in the podcast space. But people can multitask when they listen to podcasts. What they can't do is co-listen, right? You can't listen to multiple things at the same time. So they're listening to the program that they've tuned into. We've seen a bit of a spike in smart speaker, which makes sense. I still think, the smart speaker is developing to listen to podcasts in a better manner. And we're closely following that because we want to be part of that. People are listening on their computer, probably a little bit more now than before we went into the pandemic because they are at home. And of course, the smartphone and tablet is where most of the listening takes place. Smartphone being the number one spot because podcast is built for the digital age, right? When, where, and the consumer when the consumer wants it. So they can be cleaning their house, they can be washing the dishes, they can be mowing the lawn, they can be running or going for a walk and listen to a podcast now because it's easy to do on the smart speaker, or the smartphone.
Right. Is there any change that you've seen in sort of the average lengths of podcasts, and what are the average lengths? Is there sort of are the creators keeping to a particular length that's sort of snackable or digestible, or some of them doing really long format podcasts?
Well, it's all over the board, right? One of my favorite podcasts is Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. And some of those podcasts are 4 hours in length.
Right.
I drove across the country and listened to a number of those podcasts. It made my drive feel a lot shorter, but it's amazing how that host can keep you, it can keep your attention for such a long period of time. It's a fascinating show. But it's all over the board. We also see more short form content. Another kind of important entry into the space a couple of years ago was The Daily from the New York Times. And that started out short. It's a little bit longer now. I think it averages about 20 minutes in length. But we're seeing, we're testing real short form content and short form ads against that content because we feel as more and more people gravitate towards the smart speaker, short form content is going to become more important. Our platform offers a clipping tool that the the publishers can use to cut their long form content down to something very short. So it's very shareable, it's very digestible, and they can, take advantage of Google News and insert that in a much easier manner. So we're still seeing, this marketplace. Podcasts have been around for over 15 years. About 5 years ago, we really started to see the industry take shape, but we still have a long way to go, and we're still learning a lot along the way.
Any tips that you have with regards to like optimal frequencies? Because obviously, there's a sweet spot, right? If a person only hears something once, they may not digest it at all, and if they hear it too many times, eventually they want to kill themselves. I mean, certainly we've all seen those online news shows where it seems like the advertiser didn't frequency cap at all, and we're up around 100 impressions at some point.
Interestingly enough, 4 years ago, we at Megaphone did the first attribution study in the podcast space, and we learned two things. It worked. Podcast advertising works because we saw a huge spike the first week. The spike was strong the second week, and even at the fourth week, there was still 50% lift over the norm, and so it was still strong. But we saw it starting to plane off, and that was at that 4x frequency. That 4x frequency that, if you're involved with other media, it kind of tends to be that constant. And so we built frequency capping into the system.
Right.
It's interesting. If you buy show by show, it's difficult to understand what that frequency is going to look like, right? You can buy 4 ads in a particular show and you'll probably get 4x frequency in that show. But if you bought 20 other shows, you might have, if you said that 100, well, that would only be 80. But you would still have a massive frequency. That can be beneficial, though, for those direct-to-consumer advertisers that are driving to a URL with a promo code, because the listener can commit that to memory. But we felt 4x frequency was the optimal frequency for a lot of campaigns. Some of our partners like to just do one time. Others like to do more than that, and we try to accommodate. Interestingly enough, we have a product we call the first listen audio takeover, and the first ad that we deliver against our network that day is the same ad, and we can do 2 million impressions on that. And that is basically taking that digital homepage takeover and turning it in, or first point of entry, and turning it into a podcast tool. And that would be that comes in at a little bit higher than a one-time frequency, because folks might catch it on a different podcast as well.
Right. When you did your study, did you look into whether or not you could sort of reset the effectiveness by just changing up the creative?
We're testing creative in a lot of different ways. Again, we've got a sequential opportunity right now that we're just learning. We have some advertisers taking advantage of, and we're learning the effectiveness of that. The studies are coming back that it's very effective, but it's the first time it's ever been done. So that tends to also be more effective in the marketing space. So we're trying to learn as much as we can so we can share it with our partners. We do test multiple creatives, zero in on the ones that we think are going to be most effective and use those. We can then see which ones are producing better for the advertiser through attribution and zero in on those. It's not necessarily in real time. We can do it quickly, but there has to be some, there's a manual effect to that now. And it's just because of some of the limitations of the podcast space. We're getting much, much closer to digital, but we aren't exactly like digital yet.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned promo codes that our direct response advertisers obviously love. Are most of your direct response advertisers using promo codes as a way, as one of their tracking methods?
Interestingly enough, most of the direct-to-consumer advertising uses the promo code. Again, it's very effective. They've got a real good way to measure return on investment, right? If they spend $1 and get $2 back, it's working. When we got into audience targeting, we still work with a number of the direct-to-consumer advertisers. But what we did is we understood digital and where digital has gone. Our blueprint isn't. We're not a visionary at Megaphone. We're using digital as the blueprint, and 95% of our advertising is coming from the big brand agencies today. Our DTC advertising is still strong, but the brand advertising, moving them into the space, is critical to the growth of podcasting. When we launched, there was about 100 million being spent in podcasting. Today, it might be 800 million this year, 800 million this year. But there's 125 billion being spent in digital advertising. And our thought was, if we could just move a small portion of that over to podcast advertising, we're growing the whole marketplace exponentially. So again, 95% of our advertising is coming from the big brands. We measure the effectiveness through attribution and or brand lift. Interestingly enough, the brand lift studies prove very effective in the podcast space. But brand lift studies seldom don't work because everyone wants them to work, right? But in the pod space, what we see is across all KPIs, you tend to see lift, and that lift tends to be higher. One of the key reasons for that, and we can talk about the intimacy of podcasting and the in-stream messaging, but it's not a cluttered space. There's not a bank of 10 ads together. We usually go to 1 or 2 ads back to content. So it's not cluttered, and that can make it more effective. So you see, again, lift against all KPIs, and that lift tends to be higher. But we also can measure against attribution, where we can follow that listener to site start, request for quote, things of that nature, and see the effectiveness through traditional attribution in the pod space. In targeting, the URL and the promo code probably isn't as effective as it is in a host read, because that listener can go back and re-listen to that same ad with a host in that particular show. If they rewind the show, they might get another ad delivered when they're getting targeted in podcasting. It's hard to listen to that same ad.
Right. So not just looking at Megaphone, but looking at the overall industry, where do you see the future of podcasts and podcast advertising going?
Well, it's only going to grow, right? There's huge potential out there. As I mentioned, there's 125 billion being spent in digital advertising. There's less than $1 billion being spent in podcast advertising today. That's one of the key opportunities for growth. As I think about it, is as we continue to offer digital tools, today you can build podcast advertising into overall effective digital media plan, where we can pass back the data so the advertiser can retarget on social, on video, on digital display, and it can be part of this overall digital plan. And that's where I see this business going. It's going to grow in the DTC space, and it's going to grow at a significant clip for media, 20-30% year over year. But if we can bring the brands in, we can see exponential growth, and that's where I see the true opportunity in the podcast space.
Cool. Well, this is all really interesting. I look forward to following the podcast space categorically, and obviously you guys had big news recently, so look forward to following the Megaphone story over the during the integration, and assuming all that goes well.
Yeah, we're very excited about that. We're waiting on the we needed government approval and final close to the deal before I can talk more about that. But we're very excited. We think Spotify views this marketplace very similar to what we see, and that is this huge opportunity ahead of us. 125 billion in digital spend. Less than 0.5% of that is being spent in podcasting. How do we get that to 5%? How do we get that to 10%? Because we have 100 million people who have listened to a podcast in the last 30 days. So the medium has grown dramatically. Advertising tends to catch up with that type of growth.
Yep.
And there's true opportunity here. So we're excited. And I really appreciate you giving me some time today to share my thoughts on the industry.
Great. Thanks so much for joining me.